Welcome to Clarity in a Messy World, the podcast that looks at the causes behind the most confounding issues of our time. I'm David Wayne Callahan. In every episode, I'll be speaking with experts who will share their knowledge and insights and help us to untangle a seemingly chaotic world. Clarity in a Messy World is a production of Bocconi University, Milan, in collaboration with the Bocconi Student Media Center. There are places, mysterious places, where money seems to vanish. We're talking about tax havens. They took center stage 5 years ago when the Panama Papers scandal broke. What's happened since then? One thing is for sure, they've not disappeared. Hannes Wagner is Associate Professor of Finance at Bocconi University. He conducts prize-winning research focusing on corporate finance, investor activism, corporate social responsibility, institutional investors, and corporate misconduct. His work has been published in leading academic journals, as well as in The Economist, The Financial Times, and Harvard Business Review. He's won multiple awards for teaching executives and non-executives. Hannes, great to have you with us today.
Hi, David. It's a pleasure.
Hannes, be it elected officials abusing the public trust, insiders working a system to their advantage, bribery, cover-up, manipulation, corruption is in our news feeds, on our screens, and therefore probably on our minds constantly, and it's clearly one of Hollywood's favorite subjects. According to the Urban Dictionary, being called a gangster is actually considered a compliment. Why, in your opinion, is corruption so captivating?
Well, it's hard for me to have a great answer to this, but I'll try. My guess is that if you tell people a story where you say, look, in this world there are, great powers and vast amounts of money, and you can't see them because they are somewhere existing behind the scenes and they are operating in secret. And you ask people, do you believe that such a world exists? I think that many people would say, oh yeah, I completely believe that is true, just because it corresponds to this underlying sense that there must be something out there that, is going on and it's probably not good.
I like that. So it's about stories, and people take pleasure in living vicariously through these corrupt characters, possibly.
Absolutely. I think people, to some degree, enjoy the idea of observing the bad deeds that other people do. Absolutely.
Hannes, in April of 2016, the Panama Papers scandal broke. Now, for anyone who might be unfamiliar with this story, could you briefly tell us what it was about and how the papers came to light?
What happened was that roughly a year earlier, in February 2015, an anonymous hacker approached a German newspaper called Süddeutsche Zeitung. And this was really, cloak and dagger stuff. One of the journalists received a message where the hacker introduced himself or herself and wrote, "Hello, this is John Dewey, interested in data, ? So this is, an almost classic line. This is how the whole story broke. And what the hacker had to share was a very large amount of data, 2.6 terabytes, of millions of confidential documents. And at the time, that was the largest data leak that had ever happened. And what was contained in these documents were these inner workings of hundreds of thousands of offshore vehicles that a law firm based in Panama that went by the name of Mossack Fonseca, this law firm had created over a time period of almost 50 years these many shell companies for all kinds of clients around the world. And this was so enormous as a data treasure chest and in its complexity that the German journalists decided there is no way we will handle this story on our own. It's too big. And they assembled a consortium of journalists and all kinds of news organizations around the world. And they tried to figure out what were the stories hiding in this database. And they spent a year piecing the evidence together. And then in April 2016, they all went public at the same time and called this whole set of stories and the data that they were based on the Panama Papers.
Mm. And Hannes, I feel I can call you an expert on these papers because you've studied them so closely. And you've mentioned shell companies. Can you describe the overall anatomy of the offshore economy as you've discovered in your work researching the Panama Papers?
Yeah, there are several building blocks here, how I would think about them. The first building block is the users of these offshore vehicles. So these are individuals like you and me, maybe rich, maybe famous, maybe politicians, probably wealthy. And on the other hand, there are firms. So people and firms, they are the users of these secret vehicles. The second building block is what I would call the enablers. So these are the organizations or the people that help companies or the users of these vehicles to create the secrecy in the first place. So these are typically law firms, or let's call them broadly offshore service providers. So Mossack Fonseca, the law firm that I mentioned before, was one of these offshore service providers. The third building block then are these offshore vehicles themselves, and they are nothing particularly fancy. They are just private limited companies. So, just small companies that are created in a tax haven. And this is pretty normal business that is done for all kinds of purposes, but in some cases it is done for bad purposes, such as stealing money or committing fraud or cheating on tax. So these offshore vehicles. And the final building block then is, if you want to call it that way, just the money and the assets that slosh around between the real economy, so to speak, and this offshore economy. So the vehicles then are used like little boxes, and into these boxes you put the assets, so the money or a firm or a loan. You just put them inside there, and these are the building blocks, and then we have our offshore economy in place.
There were over 1,000 firms implicated in the Panama Papers. What has the fallout been for these companies in the ensuing years?
The fallout has been nuanced, I would say. So maybe let me backtrack a small amount. There were companies implicated in this, which is what our research is focused on, because this is what we are most interested in. And then there was everything else. There were the politicians and the celebrities. And in some cases, the fallout was very fast. So, for example, the Icelandic prime minister stepped down almost immediately when the Panama Papers broke. And it turned out that he had a conflict of interest, a financial conflict of interest that he had failed to disclose. So this was very fast. In other cases, it was slower. For example, it took a year for the Supreme Court in Pakistan to disqualify the incumbent prime minister. And in other cases, I would say, especially in those cases that we are most interested in, the companies that were implicated in the Panama Papers, it was even slower. Why? Because it simply takes the tax authorities and law enforcement a lot of time. It may take them years to piece together the evidence. So this has been a slow process. And what happened to the companies, this is what we showed or what we found in our research, is that the companies, for example, lost sales. So they appear to have withdrawn from some of the more corrupt countries in which they were doing business in. And yes, some people, not many people, but some people have gone to jail.
So there's been loss of revenue, and is that a result of loss of reputation?
Loss of reputation, I believe, is very important when something like this happens. It's hard to measure, so we are confident that a lot of reputation was lost in this. It's just hard to tease out statistically how to measure reputation, but unquestionably, when you are involved in a data leak and the data leak is about corruption and corporate misconduct, you look bad and you're going to lose reputation. That's for sure.
And in addition to the companies involved, a long list of people were implicated in the Panama Papers, as you've mentioned. But I was most surprised by how varied the group is. It includes some that you might expect, heads of state, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister of Iceland, government officials from around the world, organized crime bosses, and business people. But it also includes many organizations and sports figures and a vast range of celebrities. Were any actually prosecuted for tax evasion?
Yes, they were. And what's important to realize is that, of course, the work of law enforcement, and especially the work of the tax authorities, is usually silent. So this is not something that you necessarily read about very prominently in the press. But in some cases, we did read about them. So a prominent example was Lionel Messi, the soccer player. And the Panama Papers showed that he had committed tax fraud of several $1 million. And he was convicted, and this happened very publicly. I am not sure how much it hurt his reputation. He still seems to have his job, and he certainly hasn't gone to jail.
And it's very clear how offshore entities can be used legally or illegally to avoid taxation. But in a podcast last year, you spoke about how the opaqueness or the secrecy of offshore vehicles might facilitate making bribe payments and stealing from outside shareholders. Could you describe how that works in practice?
If you will, this is probably the most fascinating part, right, of all of this, digging into how does it actually work? Because this is something that usually we can't see because it's completely hidden from view. That's the point. The secrecy is the point. So one example from the Panama Papers is Siemens, which is a very large German conglomerate. And Siemens had been bribing government officials in Africa and in South America for years to win business. And that was well known. There had been lawsuits, and Siemens had admitted that they had done this, and they had paid billions in fines to US authorities and to European authorities. And how this actually worked was that the country manager for Latin America had received by the company literally a treasure chest full of gold coins. And he would make bribe payments to government officials using these gold coins. Now, what the Panama Papers revealed was something that the company didn't know, and certainly the courts didn't know, because when this whole thing went to court, the manager went free because the argument was used that he had acted only following orders of what his superiors had told him to do, which was to pay bribes in gold pieces. So that's what he did. But what the Panama Papers showed was that some of the gold he actually kept for himself and waited until the investigation had concluded. And it was clear that he wouldn't go to jail because he hadn't done anything wrong according to the letter of the law. And then he took the gold they had secretly kept from the treasure chest and deposited in a secret bank account. The law firm that helped him do all this was, of course, none other than the Mossack Fonseca law firm that the company had been using all along to make these bribe payments and set up the whole scheme. So it's really fascinating how essentially the person in charge of committing corruption became corrupt himself. And a second example that is, a more political example that also came to light in great detail in the Panama Papers is Rosia Bank. Rosia is one of the large banks in Russia, and the one bank that is said to be closest to the Kremlin by political connection. And what the Panama Papers show is that Rosia makes a loan, a normal loan, let's say it's a large loan of $200 million. And a few days after the bank makes this loan, this is now, of course, a 200 million asset that the bank has. The bank sells this asset to an offshore company incorporated, say, in the British Virgin Islands. But it doesn't sell the asset, as you would think, for $200 million. It sells the asset for $1. Okay? So there is something strange going on here, obviously. And this offshore shell company, the next day, to make it more difficult to trace, sells the loan to another offshore shell company for another $1. This is how money essentially gets transferred out of a bank and into the, if you will, private bank account of this Russian cellist.
And Hannes, in both of these examples you've just given, no one was prosecuted.
Well, yes and no. I was investigating the German manager, and I honestly do not know what happened to him. In the Russian scenario, no, there was no prosecution so far. The Russian cellist, when questioned, I think by the New York Times, why he had all this money and what he needed it for, said that he used it to buy musical instruments for disadvantaged children.
Very expensive instruments, evidently.
Exactly.
And Hannes, have the revelations of the Panama Papers had any significant impact on the workings of the financial world? For example, have new laws or procedures been put into effect to mandate transparency anywhere, or to stop or at least make it more difficult for companies, organizations, and individuals to take advantage of tax havens?
I would say here, there is good news and there is bad news. The good news is that many things have changed and continue changing. Money laundering is tightening all the time. And is now a top priority, I would say, in almost all financial markets and jurisdictions around the world. Transparency is increasing all the time. It's probably fair to say that these illegal data leaks, right? Because remember, this was a hacker who stole the data. So an interesting question is, is it ethical to steal data if the goal of the stealing is to uncover, bad things that are going on and that you know about. And so this increasing transparency seems to be helpful for bringing things to light that we should know about. And maybe most importantly, the law firm that enabled all of these things, Mossack Fonseca, had to shut down. So they no longer exist. So at least one bad player is certainly no longer in the game. On the other hand, we hear more and more stories. So the more we dig about money laundering and corruption, it seems the more we find. So we are clearly not yet at a point where things in the world are really drastically improving.
And along that line, could you tell us of similar scandals since the Panama Papers?
Yeah, so you might, of course, think, well, with the Panama Papers, the mother of all data leaks, this might conclude the story. But of course it didn't. So relatively shortly after the Panama Papers came an even bigger data leak, which was called the Paradise Papers. And this involved not, a shady law firm in Panama, but a very reputable big law firm, Appleby, that had many US-based publicly traded companies as its clients. And, it seemed to be that while Appleby was a different type of law firm that wasn't necessarily doing anything illegal, We found in our analysis, when we basically put the two leaks right next to each other, we found that some of the firms, at least, that were clients of the bad law firm Mossack Fonseca, that was shut down after the scandal, they also were clients of Appleby. So, why they were clients of both of these law firms, we're not sure. But one conclusion that to us seems somewhat fair is that maybe the business between a shady law firm and a very reputable law firm, at least by the letter of the law, is not terribly different.
It seems reasonable to predict that because of the COVID crisis, the role of government is going to drastically increase in most countries in the world for years to come. Is that a reason to actually worry less or more about fairness and the misuse of financial resources by bad actors?
I believe it's a reason to worry a lot more, because governments are relatively weak in their oversight. We are in extreme situation because of the COVID crisis. And while the government tries to do the right thing, it's up against crooks and criminals that are very sophisticated and they operate globally. So it's really not a very fair game. And to give an example here, in the UK, there has been a very successful program called the Bounce Back Loan Scheme that is aimed at providing liquidity to small businesses and to do so very fast and not asking too many questions. So this is a very good idea because it gives money to small firms, without a lot of red tape, when they most need it to keep them from going bankrupt and people losing their jobs. But the National Audit Office in the UK is already warning that, this very good idea that is trying to help the economy will very likely lose between 15 and 26 billion pounds just from fraud and possibly default of some of these loans. So clearly, bad actors are taking advantage of the government that is, just flooding the economy with money, and some of that money and potentially large chunks of that money are just going to disappear. And taxpayers, of course, will have to foot the bill, which is a very sad story.
Hannes, following everything that you've said in this entire interview, has your research made you cynical?
Fortunately, I would say no, it has not. I would say, there are clearly bad things happening here, but we can also look at this, and our job as researchers, is not to say is this bad, is it good? It's obviously depressing, but our goal is to analyze it and to understand it. And I would say it's not surprising that people do bad things. That's not surprising at all. What to me feels important is to understand how they actually do it. So if maybe as a society we sufficiently care about it, then once we understand how they do it, we could actually do something about it. And we could make it hard and costly and dangerous to steal money and to commit fraud. So, hopefully our perspective of academic research in finance is providing background to understanding how the world works. And I think indeed you can turn this around and think very positively and say that the world is actually getting better and it is getting much fairer, saying we go back in time. So we are in Italy. So let's say we go back to the 1970s. And if in the 1970s, I had told you a story that there is an Italian company and it's bribing a foreign official somewhere in Africa, and they want to get a contract to build a pipeline, it would probably just remain secret that they're doing this forever, right? And if it became public, I think people might have just accepted, some decades ago that this is just how the world is. The world is very unfair and corrupt and so on. And, if a powerful person owned a big house and was driven around by a chauffeur. And somehow the salary of the chauffeur was paid by the taxpayer, then people might have, some years ago just shrugged their shoulders and said, this is just how the world works, and the rich and the powerful, they have privileges, and that's just the way it is. And nowadays, I think people ask a lot more questions. Where is that money coming from? Who is paying for the vacation of this particular elected politician? And why are, the children of this politician apparently having so much money when their parents officially don't make so much money, and so on. So I think nowadays, such questions are very frequently being asked. And what's so nice is that increasingly we have data to find out what the answers are. So I think this is all actually very positive, and it does make the world better, and it makes it fairer, and it makes it harder and more costly to lie and to cheat and to steal.
Well, what I'm hearing here is that the world is getting better also thanks to the work of researchers like you. So we're grateful. Very nice. Could you share with us anything you've discovered in your research that actually makes you feel hopeful about the future, Hannes?
I would be most hopeful right now, not about our own research. I think we're seeing a lot of research in the medical world and technology breakthroughs and innovation that literally can change the world. For example, with a vaccine against a previously unknown virus. So I'm very hopeful that, this type of innovation in medicine is making a big impact. I'm somewhat hopeful that in finance we can contribute to innovation in similar ways, or at least enable through financial innovations and financial research the innovations that are happening elsewhere that manage to tackle real problems.
Thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Wayne Callahan, and this has been Clarity in a Messy World, a podcast from Bocconi University, Milan. Thanks for listening. You can find references from this episode in the podcast notes. To be notified when new episodes come up, subscribe to Clarity on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker.